Hey everyone, and welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today I want to talk about António Lobo Antunes' book, The Inquisitors Manual, which was published in Portuguese in 1996 and was translated into English by Richard Zenith in 2003. This book is unbelievably good. Antunes has written something like 25 or 30 books, and while he is quite famous in his native Portugal, I think that he deserves to be spoken about in the Anglophone world as really one of the greatest living authors. While I've only read 2 of his books so far, I really don't think I'm exaggerating here. Antunes is the real deal. He was born in Lisbon in 1942, and at the age of 6, he decided that he was going to be a writer. And his father, who was a neurologist, had a bit of a different plan for him and pushed him into medicine, where Antunes did become a psychiatrist. But while practicing psychiatry, Antunes continued to write. And by this point, he has won pretty much every major Portuguese literary award, and now at the age of 81, he is certainly the most famous and probably the most important living writer of Portuguese. I was introduced to Antunes, I think back in 2017, after watching a video by Paper Bird, who is a completely unique and incomparable booktuber whose videos are really just beyond description. Just go watch some of them. But he did I think a mid-year freakout tag or something like that, where he talked about reading The Return of the Caravels by Antunes. And he made it just sound so wonderful that I immediately picked it up, read it, and had no idea what the hell I just read. I really don't think I understood like 80 to 90% of it, but I really enjoyed the experience. But after that baffling experience, I let Antunes sort of fall by the wayside, and I didn't read anything else by him until this year when I picked up the Inquisitors Manual sort of on a whim and began reading. And since beginning the Inquisitors Manual, I put in a bit of effort to pick up almost every book that I can find in English by Antunes. I really think he's worth just picking up as many of his books as possible while you still can. And I know that this is lazy to even cite this, but the blurb on the back of this book compares it to both Melville's Moby Dick and Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury. And while I don't really know where the Melville comparison is coming in, I can really see where the Faulkner comparison is coming in. Even if Antunes himself, in an essay that I'll be talking about in just a second, talks about how he sort of fell out of love with Faulkner in his later years. The prose style that Antunes uses here is very reminiscent of Faulkner, in that it blends that kind of stream of consciousness with that stream of timeness, where all time is out of whack, and we get multiple points of view that all look at the same story. And the farm of Setúbal in the Inquisitor's Manual is very, very similar to the dying and decaying self of all of Faulkner's novels. But all of that said, Antunes' style, at least for me, is really difficult to pin down and to explain, because I really haven't come across anything quite like it before. His novels seem to waver between this kind of historical realism and a more kind of dream logic. And he writes about history the same way that most people write about myth. Let me just let Antunes himself explain. He wrote in this essay in 2003 that is republished in this really great collection on Antunes, which is, I believe, the only collected volume of critical studies of Antunes in English, though correct me if I'm wrong. Therefore, in my works, there are no exclusive meanings or definitive conclusions. There are only material symbols of fantastic illusions, the truncated rationality that is ours. You must abandon yourself to its apparent carelessness, to its suspensions, to the long ellipses, to the shadowy comings and goings of the waves that, little by little, will carry you to an encounter with fatal darkness, indispensable to the rebirth and renovation of the spirit. It is necessary that our trust in common values dissolve page by page, that our deceptive interior cohesion gradually lose the meaning that it does not possess, and yet that we gave it, in order that another order be born from that shock, perhaps bitter, but inevitable. I would like the novels in bookstores, rather than being placed beside one another, to be kept apart and in a hermetic box, so as not to infect other narratives or unprepared readers. It costs dearly to seek a lie and find a truth. Walk through my pages as in a dream, because it is in that dream, in its clarity, and in its shadows, that you will go about finding the meanings of the novel, in an intensity that corresponds to your instincts of clarity and to the shadows of your prehistory. And once the voyage is over and the book is closed, convalesce. I demand that the reader have a voice among the voices of the novel or poem or vision or whatever name you feel like giving it in order to be able to have a place among the demons and the angels of the earth. Any other approach to what I write is a reading, not an initiation to the wilderness where the visitors will have his flesh consumed in solitude and in happiness. It's a bit pretentious, yes, but he's really not wrong. And I think that the advice that he gives in this essay is invaluable. Don't go into his books expecting the kind of political fables that you might expect from a book like this. If you want political fables about Portuguese history, just read José Saramago. Here, with Antunes, we get visions of history, but only next to other visions of history. It is not history or even reality that populates his pages, but the reporting of the diversity or multiplicity of the experiences of reality. These political, historical, and personal realities are as real to the individuals as dreams, meaning very real. With time, they shift, alter, repeat, differentiate, echo, as memory becomes unstable, consciously or not. And the conscious instability of memory blends with the unconscious instability of memory, as each individual grapples with their own perception of reality. And Antunes refuses to offer an objective, omniscient one for the reader to grasp onto. That would be too easy, too manipulative, too insincere. The characters in his novels are not liars, but victims to all sorts of things, from very real and genuine trauma to, well, just victims to their own perception of reality. And remember that Antunes is a trained psychiatrist. His father was a neurologist. So not only is Antunes interested in the personal lived experience of individuals, but he's an expert in it in a way. Scholar Maria Alzira Seixo writes, "Yet the senses of place and identity are strongly shaken not only by the precariousness of memory in traumatic, dependent, or obsessive situations, but primarily because historical and social circumstances lead the community and individuals within it to physical and psychological displacement, as well as to the existential and epistemological uncertainty of being. It is for this reason that subjectivity emerges on such a large scale in the novels of António Lobo Antunes. The uncertainty of being, or more specifically, the problematic sense of existence, and the consciousness of life's senselessness are widely exposed in these novels. Interestingly enough, facing events in one's family, surroundings, or community is barely an objective attitude. On the contrary, it is the act of looking at particular situations and considering the facts around them that conveys in these novels the evolving impression of a character observing what happens in his or her life and in his or her world, and experiencing common situations as well as exceptional circumstances." Like a lot of Antunes' novels, the Inquisitor's Manual takes place in the dying years of Salazar's dictatorship, which was a fascist regime that ruled over Portugal from 1932 to 1968. At this book's opening, Salazar in the background has just suffered a well-earned stroke in 1968, and our central character, the minister Señor Francisco, who is a close friend of Salazar and a politician very high up the ladder, expects to be named prime minister in Salazar's stead, but isn't. The prime minister picks someone else, and scorned by this career-ending choice, Señor Francisco flees to his farm of Setúbal, which I'm probably mispronouncing, which is just outside of Lisbon, and essentially plots a kind of coup. This large socio-political conflict, though, isn't actually how this book opens. Instead, it opens with Señor Francisco's wife, Isabel, who is in court filing for divorce from Señor Francisco as she is trying to get herself and her son, João, who is a prominent character in this novel, away from him. But even this timeline isn't our central timeline, because just pages later we are introduced to Señor Francisco himself, who is lying incapacitated after a stroke that he suffered himself in an assisted living facility, while the nurses around him gently poke fun at him while changing his bedpan. And he's just laying there helpless. He's dying, but not dead. And that really sets the tone for the rest of this novel, which is really about a society dying and decaying. And this confusing timeline is really what I like about this book. It isn't just that time isn't linear in how this story is told, but it's that time itself loops and it circles back, not just between different chapters, but within the same chapter, within the same paragraphs, within the same sentences. Antunes writes in the essay that I cited earlier that a lot of readers have problems reading his books, he thinks, because they expect traditional narrative, and Antunes refuses to write in a traditional narrative form. Almost all of the misunderstandings in relation to what I do derive from the fact that what I write is approached in the way we are taught to approach any narrative, and the surprise comes from the realization that there is no narrative in the usual sense of the term, but only long concentric circles that contract and apparently suffocate us. And they suffocate us apparently so that we can breathe better. Abandon your clothing of civilized creatures, full of restrictions, and allow yourself to listen to the voice of the body. Notice how the figures that populate what I say are not described and almost do not possess distinctiveness because they are yourselves. I said some time ago that the ideal book would be that in which all the pages were mirrors. They reflect me and they reflect the reader until neither of us knows which of the two we are. I seek that each one be both, and that we return from those mirrors like someone returning from the cavern of what we used to be. Long, concentric circles that contract and apparently suffocate us. That's what we get in the Inquisitor's Manual. This entropic spiraling in both content and form reminds me a lot of some of my favorite authors, most specifically Laszlo Krasznahorkai, whose novels are currently behind this book. But both of these authors, Krasznahorkai and Antunes, seem both very aware of how oppressive political and social structures create a kind of moral decay in their own people, as they are continually degraded by those in charge, and their psyches are forever haunted by those memories. In each chapter, we're in a different character's head. There's upwards of 12.5, maybe 24 different characters and different points of view that we get in this novel. And Antunes never really tells you which head you're in each chapter. It's up to you to figure that out. Though, because he's a master of prose and a master of narrative voice, it really isn't that difficult, and you can usually tell within a couple of sentences which character you're with. But again, what's brilliant here isn't just that we're getting that sort of like standard multi-point of view and disordered timeline narrative that we get in hundreds of books. But here, within each chapter, the character's perception of narrative keeps circling back to key sentences or phrases that keep popping up inside their own heads. For example, in the first chapter, we follow João, who is Senor Francisco's son, as he is both in the courtroom with his mother, filing for divorce from his father, and also on the farm in Seixo, when his father is preparing defenses for the kind of repercussions of the coup that he was kind of preparing just a bit earlier. And in both of these different narrative spaces, this line that Senor Francisco said to João keeps popping up into João's head. The line is, "Are you a moron, young man, or are you just pretending?" His father said it to him the day that they were preparing those defenses. But the sentence stays with João the rest of his life and throughout the rest of this book, as he's constantly thinking about it. And so the narrative continually circles back to this line. It just keeps popping up out of the ether, seemingly. Not only in this chapter, where it appears over a half dozen times, but again and again throughout the rest of the novel. It just appears in the midst of a scene and then just vanishes, only to reappear just a few pages later. He is haunted by this line, unable to get past it. And this isn't the only line, of course, and it's really not only just sentences that happen. It's images and words that repeat, and each of the characters have different ones that keep appearing and reappearing again and again. These characters are just completely haunted by these memories, and they're unable to escape them. And what I really like about this is how it really illustrates how João's memory and his perception of his father is working. This line, which is a pretty cruel thing to say to a child, infiltrates every aspect of his very memory of his father and of all of these events. They go together and seamlessly blend into each other. And so each chapter in this novel follows this structure. As we follow a character in their present timeline, as these memories keep coming up and they keep circling back to them, they continually and unwillingly circle back to these memories again and again and again and again. So many of these memories in this book center on the farm of Setúbal or on Senor Francisco in one way or another. And I think what this structure really shows is the social and perhaps more importantly, the psychological hold that Senor Francisco holds on each of these characters, even while lying on his deathbed. Even if time moves on, their psyches cannot, at least not fully. The authoritarian world absorbs all of these subordinates, and even when the authoritarian is gone, the damage has been done. As Faulkner wrote, the past is never dead. It isn't even past. Again, Antunes writes as a psychiatrist, not just of individuals, but of Portugal herself. He is a psychiatrist of authoritarianism. Report. As I walked into the courtroom in Lisbon, I thought about the farm. Not the farm as it is today, with the garden statues all smashed, the swimming pool without water, the kennels and the flower beds overrun by couch grass, the old manor house full of leaks in the roof, the rain falling on the piano with the autographed picture of the Queen, on the chess table missing half of the chessmen, on the torn up carpet, and on the aluminum cot that I set up in the kitchen next to the stove where I toss and turn all night, afflicted by the cackling of the crows. As I walk into the courtroom in Lisbon, I didn't think about the farm as it is today, but about the farm and the house in my father's day, when Setúbal, a city as insignificant as a provincial small town, a few lights dancing around the bandstand in the square, flickers in the dark night pierced by the dog's anguished howls, hadn't yet reached the main gate and the willows along the wall, but sloped straight down to the river in a jumble of trawlers and taverns. Setúbal, where the housekeeper did the shopping on Sunday morning, dragging me along by the elbow under the flurrying pigeons. The house and farm from my father's day, with a staircase flanked by granite angels, with hyacinthus growing all along the walls, and with a bustle of maids in the hallway like the people bustling in the lobby outside of the courtroom. It was July, and the trees on the Rua Marques de Fronteira twisted in the sun against the building facades, in clusters that hurriedly formed and disbanded around the elevators, and amid all the witnesses and defendants and bailiffs, my lawyer, holding the sleeve of my sweater, pointed out the steps. This way, Senor João. Divorces are this way. And I, oblivious to him, oblivious to the courtroom, remembered that long ago July in Palma. And so the form of this book mirrors the function of memory. Paragraphs don't begin with capital letters because they're not the beginnings of new thoughts, but just continuations of other ones. Paragraphs don't end in periods because they don't conclude an idea, they merely just continue to advance one. In sum, the form of this book adheres to the logic of memory, not of traditional narrative. But Antunes even goes one step further because he realizes that memory isn't singular. The memories that the characters relate are not separated into true and false, as we see the same events occur again and again from different perspectives. And the memory here isn't that sort of like collective memory that you often get because the memory isn't singular and there's no attempt here to make it singular. It's contradictory. Characters' voices blend together into a multiplicity of reportage that reveals and obscures at the exact same time. The narrative, if there can even be something called a narrative here, expands outward, but it focuses primarily on that small and isolated farm of Setúbal and all of the characters who inhabit that farm in different ways. Senor Francisco is at the center, and his patriarchal, sexually violent, crass, pathetic, obsessively angry and insecure presence dominates the landscape. To the characters that he abuses, he is formidable, though to us he really comes across as pathetic, as do all dictators past their time. What's so interesting here is how he infiltrates every aspect of every life on the farm. Every character, from his son to the housekeeper to the farmer's daughter, has their interior world unalterably affected by this man and his authoritarian politics. The authoritarian regime infiltrates every aspect of the interior and moral lives of all of its citizens, it seems. And this overbearing haze that sets itself up over the farm of Setúbal affects not only the people, but the animals and the natural world as well. There's a very intense sense of place in this novel, just as there is in Faulkner's novels. As the farm isn't this idyllic space where life flourishes, but an oppressive confine that almost seems to have this gravitational pull that keeps everyone coming back, as people and animals are not able or not allowed to even try to escape it. It's poor, overgrown, decrepit, withering. And this environment really parallels the lives of all of the characters, as they are also decaying and becoming perverted. Which is creating which is unclear, as it seems that the relationship is inescapably reciprocal. A scholar, William Deresiewicz, writes that this constraining decay of the farm of Seixo is a portrait of a ruined society. This novel, he argues, becomes not an allegory of fascism, but an anatomy of the way it penetrates societies, families, psyches, bodies, and of the scars it leaves. This novel is dirty, it's mean, and it's ugly, as the dictatorial government infiltrates every aspect of the lives of its citizens and even of the very land itself. And so while this novel is very much about the sort of fall of the Salazar dictatorship, and so in a way it's also about the fall of the Portuguese Empire, in another way it's not about that at all. Instead, it's about a young boy who has a distant father and how that relationship echoes throughout his entire life. And it's about a daughter of a housekeeper who is abused by a man and who is so high above her socially that she can't tell anyone about it. It's about a woman trying to escape an unfit marriage, etc. That is, Antunes situates these personal experiences against the backdrop of history, not as a way to get at that backdrop, as most writers of historical fiction do, but to get at the individual experiences, the individual realities of each of these characters. All of this large socio-political change and these historical shifts are all sort of happening in the background. But here, they're embodied by Senor Francisco himself, the minister, whose desire for power pervades the lives of everyone around him. He is in many ways a stand-in for the dying Salazar, of course, and of the dying state. In many ways, he's the central tumor of this community. His disease is slowly spreading outwards to the rest of his community, and it's poisoning them as well. He is constantly dying, spreading his disease, but he's never fully dead. The dictatorship of Salazar is dying, but it never fully dies, at least not in the minds of our characters. Personal memory goes hand in hand with fiction, of course, which is why this novel is so concerned with reporting interiority. Interiority of the characters, interiority of the writer. That which is usually distorted or erased by history here is centered, forcing us to confront the messy subjectivity of reality. This is all to say that Antunes isn't really focused on political or historical change, but on how that change affects the individual. And his expertise as a psychiatrist makes him particularly well suited to exploring this. And I should note too that the kinds of individuals that he focuses on here in this book are the kinds that would usually be forgotten by history. Senor Francisco appears to be the main character of this novel, but he really isn't. He's at the center, but he isn't really the main character whose voice we hear the most. Instead, it's his son João, and a multitude of female characters who otherwise would be completely neglected and forgotten. And it's they who emerge as our primary characters and the primary voices of this story. Maria Alzira Seixo writes that Antunes invents in his novels a kind of poetics of distortion and erasure. And I think that's really it. Antunes really emphasizes this contradiction of expectation and reality by separating the chapters into two different kinds of chapters. There are reports and there are commentaries, which seem, at least at a first glance, to be separated into reports, objective facts, and commentaries, the subjective analysis of those facts. But really here, what I think is interesting is that, at least as far as I can tell, there are really no distinctions. There's no differences between these two kinds of chapters. And that is the irony of history, which Antunes is exploring. That is why this is the Inquisitors manual. Like a fascist, the leader of an inquisition interviews individuals before deciding himself what the truth really is. And so that's what they report in their manuals. However, here, Antunes, the author, the writer, the artist, the individual, is in control. And with that control, he relinquishes control to a multiplicity of contrary voices who speak in concentric circles, relating their infallible memory. Unlike the inquisitors of the Inquisition who control and manipulate, Antunes is actually an inquisitor in the literal sense. One who seeks, searches, one who inquires. He is not the one who answers. The way I looked at my father when a week or two after the revolution he called me, Sophia, and our kids to the farm, where he'd barred shut all the windows, locked up the paintings and the silver, freed the German shepherds from their kennels, and dismissed the maids, and he waited for us at the top of the staircase, shotgun under his armpit, and pockets bulging with cartridges. My father, still wearing his hat, and smoking cigarillos. The first communist who tries to enter gets his head blown off. Aiming his shotgun at the swamp, at the barn, at the orchard, at the cypress-lined drive, while the German shepherds rolled in the flower beds, ravaging the daffodils. The first communist who tries to enter gets his head blown off. And the lawyer in a low voice. "You can sit down." The German shepherds galloping into the house and knocking over chairs, ripping up sofas, destroying drapes, returning to the garden in a tempest of pots and casseroles, shredded pillows, curtains and towels, and my father firing at the frightened crows. The first communist who tries to enter gets his head blown off. Obliging me to help him patrol the barn, the vegetable garden, the garage, the eucalyptus trees in the swamp where the frogs wailed, handing me a pistol from his belt and snarling from under his hat, "Shoot if you see a communist." My father more alone than I'd ever seen him, with no wife, no friends, no subordinates, no associates, prodding the cows in the stables with the butt of his gun as he searched for revolutionaries in the mangers, in the milk cans, in the sack of seeds, in the straw. My father on his knees and then flat on his stomach in a pool of feces and urine, rummaging through garden tools. "Did you hear that? Did you hear that?" And a German shepherd howled outside as my father tried to get up but slipped. "What a pity your boy didn't inherit your sense of humor, Francisco." Then tried to get up again. It's them. And the dogs increased their barking. The crows, they're cackling. The beech trees, they're sowing. My father bumping into a barrel, bumping into a rake, groping on all fours for the exit. Shoot. Antunes is exactly the kind of author that I love. One who writes about these seismic shifts in history, but who is more interested in the ordinary individual during these shifts. Looking at his bibliography and just telling from the two books of his that I read, he's really interested in colonialism, in empire, in fascism, in authoritarianism, and the death of all of these things. Or at least the dying of these things. They're never quite dead. But at the same time, he seems much more interested in all of these, in how individuals function within these systems, how the ordinary oppressed people are affected by them. And he's just an author with a very distinct prose style and narrative voice that adds so much to the ideas that he's exploring. The Inquisitor's Manual is simply an incredible book and one that I heartily recommend you get your hands on and begin reading immediately. This is a great work by one of the greatest living authors. I'm convinced of that. But let me know if you've read António Lobo Antunes. I would really love to hear from you. And I'd really like recommendations on what of his I should be reading next, because I'm very eagerly looking forward to reading more of his bibliography. But for now, thanks for watching.